This is study 8 of our study in the letter to the Philippians, and today we are in chapter 2, verse 12 to 18. But before we do that, we're going to look at the answers to the questions we had from chapter 2, verse 5 to verse 11. The first question was about how Jesus Christ humbled himself. And the answer is this: Jesus, before becoming a human, existed for all eternity as God and equal with God. Yet knowing who he was, he humbled himself by emptying himself. Not that he wasn't God anymore, but that he set aside his place and he became a human servant, fully obedient and pleasing to God in all that he did. But then he humbled himself even more, and not only did he humble himself to obedience, but he humbled himself to the point of death. And even more than that, the most humiliating and shameful death from both the Roman perspective and from a Jewish perspective, because he was hung on the tree. Cursed is the one who hangs on a tree. He suffered even the death of the cross. So the second question then was about how this really embodies verse 2 to 4. And this is exactly what verse 2 to 4 is challenging us to do, to not only live for ourselves and think about our own wants and needs, in a world where we are encouraged to push ourselves to the front and to climb the ladders. Jesus, who was at the front and who's at the top of the ladder, so to speak, humbled himself to the very bottom. He went to the very back to love and care for and serve and even die for others. So he really was living out verse 2 to 4 as God made flesh. Question 3 then was how God then exalted him. And verse 9 begins with therefore. So because God was pleased with Christ's willing condescension, he raised him up again. He exalted him. He's given him a name above all names. He's made it that every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. And really the secret is that the way to success in the Christian way, in the upside down world of Christianity, is that the way up is to go down, which is quite a challenge for us in our day. Now, questions then for chapter 2, verse 12 to 18. Question 1. What does it mean to work out your own salvation in verse 12 to 13? So I want you to read verse 12 and 13 and ask that question, not just verse 12. What does it mean to work out your own salvation in verse 12 to 13? And I would encourage you once again, in light of that question, to go back to chapter 1, verse 9 to 11. Question 2, how does verse 14 to 15 describe what it looks like to live as a child of God? So Paul talks about being a child of God and shining his lights in this generation. And verse 14 really gives us the way to live as a child of God. So what does verse 14 to 15 describe when it talks about living as a child of God? What are the commandments there? Question 3, how does Paul live out the challenge of verse 2 to 4 and the example of verse 5 to 11 in verse 16 to 18. Just ask that again so we can get it. But how does Paul live out the challenge he gives in verse 2 to 4 and the example of Christ that he presents in verse 5 to 11 in the way that he lives out his life in verse 16 to 18? So hopefully those questions make a little bit of sense, and I hope it's helped you to go through that beautiful passage in the letter to the Philippians. God bless.